This Week in Agribusiness, serving America's most essential industry, is brought to you by Case IH.
On this week's This Week in Agribusiness, ag lenders gather together to assess the outlook for the year ahead. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us here for This Week in Agribusiness. I'm Mike Pearson in the studio, but we're joined now by Max Armstrong. Max, we saw some ag lenders get together this past week, and they're taking a look at the ag industry this year, aren't they?
You know, that meeting that's held every year, the Ag Division of the American Bankers Association, is always interesting because you get a real feel for what's happening among those lenders across the country, Mike. You know, it's always held in November, and they generate a survey. Farmer Mac worked with the association to come up with a survey of the banker concerns about their farmer customers, what farmer customers would be most worried about. And farm income was the top of the list there, as I recall. That was, of course, the thing that they'd be thinking about. Many feeling that farm income would be slipping back a little bit from the current level. But I thought it was interesting that recession was high on their list. That was one of the top 5 concerns. You expect weather, you expect farm income, but a recession, and of course, it depends on which sector you're talking about. Some areas of agriculture would have to be most concerned about recession. You would think, for example, about the meat sector, selling into a recession. Others maybe not so worried about it, perhaps.
That's true, Max. And, you know, one of the things we've seen ongoing for the better part of this past year has been the rise in interest rates coming from the Federal Reserve. I would imagine that ag lenders were paying pretty close attention to what's going on in the interest rate front as well.
Oh, you bet. It's a big concern for them directly because of the volatility in interest rates, the volatility that is created. But, yeah, you know, you have to remember, going back to the big ag recession of the 80s, the second highest cost of doing business for farmers was the cost of money. And when you look at what happens with interest rates, what has already happened, that's a fairly substantial increase for those who have borrowed or have to borrow, certainly for production expenses going into the next year. The recession thing is an interesting one to look at as I look back on what happened in the 80s, because back in the 80s, there was a very big difference between the Western Corn Belt and the Eastern Corn Belt, and that had to deal with off-farm income. And as you know, a lot of our farmers today have off-farm jobs, or their spouses do, not just for the insurance, but also that income coming in. And so it was interesting. Back in the 80s, you had the Eastern Corn Belt, where you had a lot of farmers who were picking up jobs in automobile plants or plants that supplied automobile plants in places like Michigan, Ohio, Indiana. That wasn't the case. You know, the off-farm jobs in Iowa back in those days were very much tied in to the farm economy, and we had 2 different worlds there. So it'd be interesting to see if recession then does have an impact again on agriculture, if we get into one next year, which everybody, well, most all of the experts think we will.
Indeed, they do, Max. You know, I had a chance this past week to talk with Kurt Covington from Ag America Lending. We were talking about the interest rate hikes, and I asked him, what's this going to do for farm land values looking ahead? And he said, well, a lot of land is still being bought with cash, but no doubt those buyers are going to be looking for other places to put their money as interest rates start to change. And Max, I thought that was interesting, given the conversations we've been having about land prices here over this past week. Had some more big sales, I think we can say.
Yeah, exactly. And there was a survey of the bankers, what they're thinking about in terms of land values. 60% of them felt that the farmland values would be at least level. And about 13% indicated they were looking for a decline in farmland values. Well, that leaves about a fourth then of the opinion that they're going to keep on moving up, so we'll see.
We certainly will. There was a sale earlier this past week in Sioux County, Iowa, Max. I'm sure you saw the headlines. I believe it set a new record for farm price, brought $30,000 an acre on a 73-acre parcel. Auctioneers said there was no development ground. It was 2 neighboring farmers getting together to bid on a piece. So there is still some cash out there in farm country.
That's what we've seen time after time. It was producers doing the bidding in many instances where we've seen these elevated values. And that part of the world, too, do you not have some livestock helping perhaps drive up that value because of the land that is needed there?
Indeed, we do, Max. Northwest Iowa, home to a thriving dairy industry, a lot of cattle feeders, and a lot of pork production. Very similar to what you see in parts of Ohio. The area where you mentioned you can get that diversification in place sometimes leads to greater returns on the farm. Well, thanks, Max, and we'll check in with you a little bit later to meet a farmer from Shelbina, Missouri. This portion of This Week in Agribusiness is brought to you by Firestone Ag. The Firestone Ag Dealer Network offers you the support, inventory, and resources you need. Visit firestoneag.com to find your local certified dealer. And it's time to talk markets here on This Week in Agribusiness. Joining us this week is Dan Bassey, president of Ag Resource Company. And Dan, we continue to see geopolitical events around the world impact the American ag markets. I'm curious. We saw President Biden, President Xi Jinping of China shake hands. What does that mean for ag exports to China in your mind?
You know, I would like to tell the American farmer that it means more trade, but unfortunately I probably can't. We believe that this globalization that has been going on for the last 20 years has now become regionalization. And so, you know, the Chinese are going to be buying where prices are cheapest, at least nearby. We think that's going to be down in South America. Brazilian corn is trading 70 cents a bushel less than the United States. Brazilian soybeans are 80 cents a bushel less than the United States out of the U.S. Gulf. That's going to be where China's focusing its attention, at least for the next 6 to 9 months. You know, I believe if Brazil has a record large soybean crop, increasingly China will put its demand into South America. There's still political tensions in the background. Biden's handshake didn't diminish that. This whole thing about computer chips and where we're sitting today with China is going to be a fly in the ointment longer term, especially for U.S. ag trade.
You know, Dan, you mentioned the potential of a record crop coming out of Brazil. I'm curious, how does that crop look so far this growing season? Are we still planning for that record size?
Well, we're about 70% planted. I have an office in Sao Paulo, and so we also have an office in Mato Grosso. And so we are seeing good starts, at least to the crop as it sits today, much better than last year. And so our estimate for South America is 156 million metric tons of soybeans. That's 4 million metric tons more than USDA. Our farm clients down there are planting extra acres. What's been happening as Lula has become president of Brazil, the real has been slipping. That gives more profitability to the Brazilian farmers, and they are responding with extra acres. Every farm client that we have tells us that I'm trying to squeeze out that extra 3 to 5%. So look for soybean and corn acreage, planted acreage to go up. If Mother Nature is kind, even a 160 million metric ton soybean crop is not impossible. Going back in time, remembering a year ago, the crop was somewhere around 128. So it would be a big impact on the world market. And this would cause Brazil to export soybeans all the way into our new crop next October, November.
So, Dan, I mean, that positive farmer sentiment down there in Brazil, that desire to plant more acres, is that matched across the border in Argentina?
Well, it's not quite as robust in Argentina, where the politics are a little more, how should I say it, frayed and volatile. The peso down there has been, of course, depreciating rather rapidly. That has helped the farm economy, but also input costs are rising, and Argentinian farmers are dealing with a insipid drought that goes back for the past 5 months. So the optimism is there in Argentina. They accelerated their plantings this week, but at the moment, because of the volatility of the currency and the government, they're just not quite as robust as what we're seeing in Brazil.
Now, taking the focus back to China, Dan, while we've got you here, do you anticipate, or does the market anticipate, China reopening in a big way here in the short term?
So China's had this 0% COVID policy. They have modified it around the edges for travelers and maybe visiting in different provincials as we head into the Lunar New Year on the 22nd of January, the year of the rabbit. But as we think of COVID, it's not the year of the rabbit for it. It's probably going to hang on in their zero tolerance policy, we're being told, all the way till next spring. With that in mind, Chinese GDP rates will continue to slow, and that will have an impact on their demand profile. The only element that's offering support to agriculture is the Chinese pork producer is seeing good margins, maybe as much as $100 a hog. So that will help out the feeding classification of what it'll be utilizing going forward.
All right, lots to break down there in China. That hog industry has seen a lot of back and forth. Folks, we're going to continue breaking down these market moves with Dan Bassey of Ag Resource Company here when This Week in Agribusiness returns. This portion of This Week in Agribusiness is brought to you by Firestone Ag. Harvey Firestone invented the first pneumatic farm tire, forever changing what it means to farm hard. Visit firestoneag.com to learn more about this history and tire solutions for today. Welcome back, folks. We're discussing the markets with Dan Bassey, president of Ag Resource Company. And Dan, you mentioned something in Brazil. You said the real has been slipping, providing additional returns to Brazilian growers. And I'm curious because we've seen the U.S. dollar slipping quite a bit over the last 10 days. Is that trend going to continue?
We're doubtful that that dollar break will be lasting. We think it's a big correction in an overall bull market of the dollar. We think the Fed is still going to raise interest rates another 0.5 or 0.75% in December. We're leaning on the half rate, and then maybe another couple times next week. Putting that inflation genie back in our 2% bottle is going to be difficult. And so as we think of the future, it's going to be a bumpy ride in 2023 with a combination of recession, high interest rates, and what we would consider to be the reset of the dollar and, of course, interest rates longer term. We think the days of 0% rates and QE, if you will, quantitative easing, are over with for an extended period of time.
Dan, with that being the case, are you advising growers here this winter to do anything in preparation for those higher rates to come, or do we just wait and see what they look like?
Well, I think the higher rates are here today almost. I say that because if you're a borrowing for operational capital on the farm, you're now looking at the highest rates in a decade. So as you look at what was just published from the 7th District of the Federal Reserve Bank, farm loan rates are up to levels now, approaching 6.5%. This is something that's far different than the last couple of years and will have an impact on operational revenue. The big thing we have in terms of talking to farm clients is everyone's got their hand in the pocket of the U.S. farmer right now, whether it's chemicals or seed, fertilizer, everything costs more. It's hard to take those hands out. And when that happens, we need to be very focused on grain markets and locking down at least some profitability heading into a new growing season.
Dan, I'm glad you brought up those rising input costs. They're squeezing farmers all around the globe, energy being one of the biggest squeezers out there. As you take a look at crude oil, perhaps natural gas prices getting through this winter, what are your expectations?
Well, the big problem was the EU and whether they would have enough energy to make it through winter. We think that you never get hit by the train that you can see. It's always a train you can't see. So, we think the EU will make it through. They've been planning. They've been bringing in energy for much of the last 5 months. So that'll be helpful to them. In the U.S., crude oil prices are likely to keep tumbling a little bit here due to the recession. The U.S. Central Bank is using that blunt instrument of raising rates and trying to destroy demand. And that demand destruction will get rates lower. But longer term, it's like pushing that beach ball underneath the water. It will come back, popping back late winter, spring. And so I want farmers to think about early 2023 about locking down some energy and getting diesel needs in particular covered for the spring planting timeframe.
That certainly makes sense. Buy when you can, not when you have to. Dan, I'm curious, turning to our focus to the livestock markets, we see them be one of the places that are going to be impacted by higher inflation, dairy in particular. What's your take here on the U.S. dairy industry as you look out into the winter of 22?
Well, the good news on U.S. dairy is that it's going to be well supported near $18 or $18.50 relative to Class 3 milk. I say that because herd sizes and production in New Zealand and Europe is now in decline. And we think this decline will go on for an extended period of time. That means that residual world demand gets pushed back at the U.S. So that's an underpinning for Class 3. But on the other side of this, because U.S. farmers are expanding their cow herd once again, we think that 23 or 24 will be the upside for Class 3 as we think about maybe a peak in the summertime. So as we stand back, it's an 18 to 23 or 24 market. I wish I could be more bullish than that, but we need to see the world economy come out of this recession for that next leg of the bull market to really take hold.
Dan, recessionary talk, will it impact the live cattle markets here as we go through winter?
It'll have a drag effect on demand, but U.S. fed cattle supplies appear to be so tight as we head into next year that there's still a demand lingering underneath the surface. I think if my hand were up in the bull market for 2023, it would be cattle, and we are forecasting record high cash cattle prices, principally in that March-April timeframe. So as you think about cattle, it's fed cattle supplies. Cow slaughter for the last 3 years because of the drought in the West has been astronomical. And so we just do not have the cows available going forward to produce calves, which is going to give us a longer duration bull market in beef and pork values as we think forward to 2025.
Record high cash cattle prices potentially coming spring of next year. That will be interesting to see. Dan Bassey, President, Ag Resource Company, thanks for joining us this week.
Oh, you're very welcome. Have a great weekend.
Chad Colby's look at agriculture technology comes your way next, brought to you by the IBM Watson Decision Platform. Combining AI with Internet of Things data to help agribusiness increase yields, improve quality, and drive sustainability.
As harvest season comes to a close, learning season gets underway. Our very own tech guru Chad Colby loves making it to farm shows to see the newest technology on offer.
Mike, you're absolutely right. It's November. There's a little bit of snow outside my office with the colder temps this week. It's time to talk about the winter farm show season. You know, for me, the big farm show is the Farm Progress Show, and that's for a lot of reasons. Largely because of its size, there's a lot of equipment to see, and there's those great demonstrations that we all love to see out in the fields. But I will tell you, in the winter season, that brings another great opportunity, and that opportunity is to maybe go look at a show you've never been to, like the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas. There's nothing like that show. If you like to see technology, quite frankly, that'll make your head spin a little bit. And don't worry, there's definitely some folks in agriculture there. We know John Deere's been going there for years, showcasing their latest in technology. Another great show is the World Ag Expo. That's in Tulare, California. And that show, quite honestly, it's pretty impressive. I know some farmers from the Midwest who've seen that show over the last several years and tell me the same thing. It was definitely worth attending. There's a lot of specialty equipment there you just don't see in the Midwest. Things that, quite honestly, we never see in corn and soybean country, but play a key role in agriculture around the world. And whether that's raising almonds or grapes, you got to have equipment to do it, and that show is a great one to do that. It takes place in February, the same time as the National Farm Machinery Show in Louisville, Kentucky. And as we all know, that show's got a lot of equipment. It's got some fun tractor pulls at night, which are always great to see. But the manufacturers there really showcase at that show what kind of the latest and greatest is for the next year, largely because of its big attendance. But I also would like to encourage you to maybe take a look at some of the regional shows in your area. I know for me personally, I've been attending the Indiana Farm Equipment and Technology Expo, and I talked to them this last week. They're sold out. I remember as a young man going to the Greater Peoria Farm Show, wearing my blue jacket, which, Mike, I don't know if I could fit into anymore, but that show's going on as well. And finally, I want to remind everyone, there's a lot of great other learning opportunities. Maybe that's Precision Planning's winter meeting or attending the Farm Future Summit. Again, these opportunities give you the ability to maybe go out and do a little more research on your farm or ranch.
Thank you, Chad. It'll be so great to get out in person again at all these farm shows. Folks, stick around. We'll be taking a look at weather later on the show. Inflation, interest rates, the cost of doing business is climbing, and it's something that a lot of folks in the economy are keeping an eye on, including the Federal Reserve. Early in November, we saw an update on the CPI, that inflation data, and I was curious how it would impact the agricultural markets. Joining us now is Tommy Grisafi. And Tommy, when we think about inflation and interest rates, there's a lot of overlap. What's the Fed watching when they determine the Fed funds rate?
Well, there's a lot of things, but the price of commodities, the price of wages, you combine what it costs to pay someone and what it costs to live. And they look at things like auto prices, new autos, used autos, and you combine all that together, and fuel, which is in the commodity sector. And that's one of the indications. You have CPI, PPI, Producer Price Index, Consumer Price Index, and these things are all these terms that everyone's watching. It's like a fireworks show now when these numbers come out at 7:30. And the Fed's watching those things and other economic gauges and to play their next move.
And the moves have been, Tommy, 75 basis point increases, just about 3/4 of a percentage point hikes in the Fed funds rate. Given this last CPI report, what do you think the Fed's going to do, or what does the market think the Fed's going to do?
Well, the market, and then you were telling me there's a tool at the CME Group called the Fed Watch tool. When you combine what these futures in the forward curve of the futures are looking at, and this was finally the numbers starting to come down. Inflation's coming down, but it's still high. It's still really high. So the markets had a relief rally and said, oh, inflation is not as bad, but yet it's still bad. And the way we can tell that is that the 2-year note's at 4.5%, but real inflation still at 7.5%. And to get inflation down, you need to get that 2-year note lower than that inflation level. And so they went 0.75 several times. Now there's a 6 to 9 month lag, Mike, between those rate hikes and what it means. So like the young couple going out to buy the house who were thinking about buying it 6 months ago, their world just got rocked when they see an 8% mortgage versus what they could have locked in for 3.5 a year ago. These are real things that are real. This takes us back to high school economics and basic math of money has a cost. And we went through this decade where money was relatively the same price, 3-4%, and that's over. And so for a young farmer, my fear is that they're storing an asset that's depreciating and paying a lot to have and produce that asset, whether it be corn or any other industry. So the ag's really expensive right now, and it's costing a lot to do business.
And Tommy, it sounds like with inflation still being as high as it is, the Fed is likely still going to raise rates. So it seems like there could be more headwinds ahead on the cost of doing business.
Right, and you'll hear this term pivot, you'll hear this term soft landing. We'll see if they can do it. They say it's a very hard thing to do.
Indeed. Tommy Grizzoffi, ATI, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, that same volatility that's impacting the ag industry makes it important that the folks who cover the ag industry are up to speed on what's going on in the industry. To that end, members of the National Association of Farm Broadcasting gathered this past week in Kansas City for their annual update. Joining us now is the executive director of that group, Tom Brand. Tom, tell us, how many folks did you have get together in KC this past week?
Mike, we had probably one of the best turnouts we've had in a long time, with over 700 different members and guests and speakers that were part of this year's 79th NAFB convention at the Westin Crown Center in Kansas City. Just an outstanding crowd.
It is an outstanding crowd. And Tom, there's a lot going on in the industry of agriculture right now. What was on the minds of members, or what was under discussion at convention?
A lot of different newsmaker sessions that we had with folks to talk about anything from agriculture law and taxes to looking ahead to what the effects of Proposition 12 might be that's coming out of the state of California on all the agriculture community. We also heard from an analyst that talked about the outcome of the election and how that can change things for the agriculture committees on both the House and Senate side, as well as looking at future policy there. We discussed soil health, and we went through some professional improvement sessions that covered anything from podcasting to doing an ideas exchange. And then really the cornerstone of our convention each year is an event we call Trade Talk. It's where ag organizations and associations and companies come in, and they'll have farm broadcasters do interviews with them all day long, one of these days of the week, and probably around 2,500, 3,000 interviews done with the over 130 farm broadcasters that were registered to be a part of this year's meeting.
That is incredible, Tom. On that front, that Trade Talk front, tell us, how does that compare to years past? Is there more excitement for agriculture?
Absolutely. Early on, we had a lot of interest from potential sponsors and Trade Talk exhibitors to be a part of our convention. In fact, it's the largest Trade Talk event that we've had in the history of the association. 111 booths in our trade show this year, a bit of an expansion from what we've had in the past. Over 100 different exhibitors that were a part of that. There is a buzz in the agriculture community about what's going on with technology and some of the latest trends in agriculture. So we saw some new companies that were a part of that mix this year, as well as some of the folks that have been with us since we started the Trade Talk back in the latter part of the 1980s.
It's incredible how this industry is always changing. Tom, from the perspective of farm broadcasting, how's that industry sitting here in 2022? Are more folks looking to farm broadcasters for answers in these crazy times?
If you'd roll the clock back 20 years, Mike, there weren't as many farm broadcasters then as there are today. And I think that's a statistic that surprises people. There is a connection that farm broadcasting has with their community. Yes, there's information sources that are available that come from a variety of different areas, but farm broadcasters have a unique relationship with their audience, whether it's on radio or on television. Folks like tuning in and being connected to that farm broadcaster and the events that he or she is covering, no matter where they are across the country.
That is certainly true. Tom, we wish you and your members of the NAFB a great year here in 2022. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks as always.
And folks, stick around. We'll continue our Plan Smart, Grow Smart series when we return.
This Week in Agribusiness, serving America's most essential industry, is brought to you by Case IH.
Welcome back to This Week in Agribusiness. Thanks for making us a part of your weekend. Recently, Max had the chance to travel down to Missouri, Shelbina, Missouri, in fact, to meet a new grower as part of our Plan Smart, Grow Smart series with our friends from BASF. This week, he's meeting Brian Thrillkill and learning about his operation.
Tell us about Shelbina, Missouri. What do we need to know about it? What's the lay of the land here?
Elevators, farm community, just good hometown people and small businesses, I guess. We farm all kinds of ground, from flat to rolling to clay to lots of pasture. So we got a very mixed geography, I guess you should say.
Is there quite a bit of tiling that's done in this part of the world? I noticed you have quite a few flat fields, and yet, as you point out, there's quite a roll to some.
Not much tiling, but a lot of terracing. There's lots of terracing, a lot of CRP, buffer strips, waterways and stuff like that you can still get cost share on, and a lot of that goes in every year. So.
Talk about your family operation and how you got started farming yourself.
Well, it's kind of funny. I'm a first-generation farmer. Always wanted to farm from when I was a little bitty, carpet farming on the, in the living room. And in 1993, I had the opportunity to buy my first tractor. There was a neighbor there that come to me and said, "I don't know how you're ever going to pay for this tractor." He says, "I think you need some more farming ground." And so I started farming his ground in 1993, and we still farm it today.
It's kind of unusual for me to sit down across from a first-generation farmer. There aren't too many of you around who are as progressive as you are and successful as you have been, Brian. Talk a bit about that, how that has shaped your business.
I didn't know anything, so anytime I could get knowledge from anybody, anywhere, magazines, people, talk, and there's never a dumb question in farming. So if you don't know, you ask or you listen. And so I just took that and just used it in my operation to just try to make it better. I want to be one that's on the cutting edge of the new technologies, and I love to do trials. I love to try new stuff, new technology, new genetics. I'm from Missouri. I'm the show me state, so you got to show me and make me a believer, and then once I'm on board, I'm good to go.
Are there any people who stand out in your mind who really made a difference for you and your operation?
I've had a lot of help along the way from different people. I work with Jason Pollard, and he's been my rep for 8-9 years now, and known him for years, and we usually have 8 to 10 conversations a year. We'll sit down and make a plan for this coming year and see what's on the radar, what I'm thinking, what he's thinking, and we'll have a full game plan for the whole season. That's what it's come down to, is hard work and somebody just giving you a chance. So here I am, and I just love to do it, and it's me and my wife and my 2 sons and my daughter, and I'm here to make a living, basically, for my family.
Thanks, Max. And folks, we'll be seeing more of Brian's operation as the weeks go by. But in the meantime, if you want to see all of the videos done under the Plan Smart, Grow Smart series, you can visit us on the web at plansmartgrowsmart.com.
Greg Solier now brings us his farm weather forecast for the week ahead, presented by Pivot Bio Proven 40. Predictable, productive, weatherproof. Turn to a better nitrogen. Turn to Pivot Bio Proven 40. Learn more at pivotbio.com.
Well, it's time to turn our eyes skyward, see what the weather has in store for us. Joining us for that update is meteorologist Greg Solier. And Greg, let's look out at the Pacific Northwest. What's developing out there after they've come through such a damaging fire season?
Exactly, and they've had a series of systems over the past few weeks that have brought at least some degree of moisture and an easing of the fire situation, and a general, somewhat localized, however, improvement to the drought pattern. And no real big moisture pattern and precipitation events into the Northwest for this week. That's good news as you make plans for going to and from friend and family for the upcoming Thanksgiving holiday. Still some cold air, down 15 to 18 below Cut Bank and Havre last week, and still some of that Arctic air entrenched across the northern plains and through the Canadian Prairie. There's a system offshore the Pacific Northwest, but early in the week, a pretty quiet one, chilly one. We've even had some frost and freeze into the northern and central valleys of California. This next weather system moves inland. Its eastern flank will begin later in the week towards the holiday, generate a couple of showers of rain and snow there, a couple of snow showers and flurries in the cold air across the Dakotas, and that is it. If you can deal with the cold, a little snow on the ground, actually still a lot of it on the ground out through Big Sky Country, all the while better. Remember, it's moisture ultimately, hopefully, will get it to percolate into these dry soils. Cool weather, but it's a Santa Ana condition as well into Southern California, with high pressure across areas of the high plains and regions of the desert desert southwest, the high plains areas into the central plains, looking at a weak weather system coming inland from there. A little bit of rain and snow mixed. Of course, nothing to generally improve the drought weather pattern, which continues on. We've seen some improvement east into areas of the Ozarks and southward, and the shore flow is onshore here, upper level winds, and so there's milder Pacific air into the valleys of California. Still some windy Santa Ana conditions through southern reaches. Sunshine for the desert southwest. A couple of snowflakes as the cold begins to moderate, not necessarily a warm up, but moderate across the Great Plains later in the week towards the holiday.
Well, Greg, across the central part of the U.S., that cold weather was certainly the headline this past week. You mentioned moderation. How far does that moderation spread?
It will spread ultimately into the eastern Corn Belt, but yeah, over towards last weekend, we had some of those snows down towards St. Louis and downstate southern Illinois, down through Kentucky. Those were record-setting, as in the earliest date for significant measurable snow. Now, here's a weak system across the plains. It will, with time, make its way into the Corn Belt. Otherwise, it is just cold and more or less a December to early January feel, but opportunities, especially through Michigan, Indiana, and Ohio for some harvest until we get to the Thanksgiving holiday. While it looks impressive on the weather maps and charts, it's a weak system, light moisture, a little snow and rain into the Corn Belt locales later on into the week. Southern plains, of course, the ongoing dryness and drought, but we've had some degree of moisture, including some snowfall last week and the cold weather. Weak system coming out of New Mexico, one down through the Gulf Coast, had some chilly rains last week. Yeah, cotton harvest from the Delta on eastward is still a bit delayed, but it's still cool to cold, high pressure to the southern plains. And again, towards Thanksgiving holiday, a little bit of a rain across the deep south and southeast, and a couple of snowflakes as far south as the Ozarks.
Greg, what's in that crystal ball for the eastern Corn Belt over to the eastern seaboard?
Early in the week, opportunities again. It's Michigan, parts of Indiana, and Ohio that are still a little bit behind in wrapping up the harvest season. Points westward across Minnesota, the Dakotas, Nebraska. We're basically done. Cold weather across the northeast of New England. Some lake snows have been pretty busy. Here's the next weather system down across the Ozarks and the southeastern plains. It will generate a little bit of light rain and snow west to east across the Corn Belt into the northeast of New England. No big travel issue, no big storms anticipated there as we get towards Thanksgiving and beyond. Some chilly rains across the Gulf Coast area, cold high pressure, some frost and freeze in the Tennessee Valley and the Carolinas, and a drop off in temperature and just a little spot of moisture into the southern plain states areas early on. Later in the week, some shower and thunderstorm activity expected over the southeastern states, some rains down through Florida, but again, despite the opportunity for outdoor work, at the same time, some cotton harvest delays continue on in the southeastern states.
Greg Solier is back with his extended farm weather forecast for the country, presented by Pivot BioProven 40. Predictable, productive, weatherproof. Turn to a better nitrogen. Turn to Pivot BioProven 40. Learn more at pivotbio.com.
And we're back talking weather with meteorologist Greg Solier. And Greg, next week, one of the biggest travel weeks of the year for Americans. How's it going to look?
I think relatively okay. Nothing major from what we see here. Yes, we do paint the weather maps and charts with some degree of moisture. Not a big wound up winter system. Some winter moisture, as we've seen here over the past week to 10 days. And the cold air is present as well. And here's kind of the average rain snow line. So yeah, there may be a propensity through the Great Lakes region for a bit of measurable snow. Some rain as you venture to the Ohio Valley. Main thing, some additional cotton harvest delays here, and towards the really end part of the holiday and the holiday itself, this is where the wet weather will materialize with the snow to the upper Midwest, parts of the Dakotas, Pacific Northwest, high and dry in the desert southwestern sections of the country. So again, generally speaking, Mike, a very manageable Thanksgiving holiday travel scene is expected.
Well, Greg, the week after we get to the end of November, how does that temperature start to look?
Well, temps are still on the colder side here. This prod of Arctic air continues to modify, not necessarily warm up, but still a bit below average here over about the eastern third of the country. Back to average or normal Great Lakes region out of the southern plains. Yes, there's a flood of milder Pacific air moving across the western states, so a big improvement expected there coming off the chill into the valleys of California. And it is a pretty quiet weather pattern as well. Opportunities to try and put a wrap on it across sections of the eastern Corn Belt. Still some wet weather up and down the eastern seaboard. This is okay considering there's dryness and drought here up through the Canadian Prairie, southern reaches, and back in the Pacific Northwest. An active weather pattern. Much of the heartland is expected to be high and dry.
Well, Greg, the week of December 5th, what do you anticipate?
That milder Pacific air expected to kind of fragment off a little piece over the southwestern sections of the country, holding up over the deep south and southeastern. We do get a lobe of some colder air into the northern plains and areas of the Great Lakes region, so a hint of winter time here, but nothing unusual for the time of year. There is a bit of a trough forming up here over the nation's heartland, and as a result, weather becomes a little more busier. Nothing major, but a couple of systems will move on through. This is beneficial to snowfall for the northern plains, parts of the upper Midwest into the Great Lakes region. Probably rain from the I-70 corridor on southward. Wet weather over the southeastern part of the country. West Texas cotton in the desert southwest and Southern California expected to be dry.
Well, Greg, by the time we get into mid-December, that week of the 12th, does that cold area start to expand?
From our vantage point here, it will, and there's a pretty good slug of it coming in here into the eastern part of the country, and this is probably going to be the groundwork as we get into January and beyond, where Arctic air is here, warmth is here, and ultimately the weather pattern turns far more active. So again, warmth across the western part of the country, normal temperatures over the southwest into the upper Midwest and southern Canadian prairie, but at the same time, at least from this vantage point, in through mid-December, it's a very quiet weather picture from Texas to the Great Lakes region into the northeast to New England. Most of the action is from the high plains in through the Pacific Northwest and southward in through California, and a normal precipitation pattern across much of the Plain States area. So overall, looks like here the next several weeks in relatively good shape. Not much in the way of significant improvement to the drought weather pattern, which continues on much of the plains, Corn Belt locales, and points on westward. We're hoping for a wet weather season over the western half of the country. But it's La Nina which is in charge. And with that in mind, we'll certainly take a look at the drought monitor and expectations for the rest of the month of November from a drought outlook standpoint coming up later on in the broadcast. Stay with us.
Next on This Week in Agribusiness, it's Max's Tractor Shed, spotlighting another great American tractor.
Hey, to Max's Tractor Shed this weekend, a look at some more of those auger tractors. Well, many have been put away, no doubt. We still have a few out there operating. I'll talk about it in Max's Tractor Shed, brought to you by Store Lock Tool Cabinets. I had someone ask me the other day, can you get all of the tools in there? Can you get some dividers? You better believe it. They can help you organize your tools. They have those dividers that fit right in there for the Store Lock Tool Cabinets. Find out more about the configurations at storelock.com. Well, there's still some crop out there in the field. As of about a week ago, they still, for example, had about a fourth of the corn acreage standing out there in Wisconsin and Michigan, providing some shelter for the deer. They'll get through it here before too long. By the way, that was ahead of normal progress, as I recall, looking at those numbers. But they're still augering corn in some spots. These pictures might have been taken in some warmer days of fall. A Minneapolis mow lead. On duty in Illinois, Kyle has this 1974 G1355. In Missouri, this John Deere 4230 is doing duty all of these years after it was made back in 1973. Mark in Wisconsin has this good-looking 1963 Farmall 560 there on the right. And in Nebraska, Joe has the IH 1206. A great tractor made in 1966. And here's that other Mini. David has this Minneapolis Moline, this UTU, made in 1952. Well, let's get our weekly report now from Mark Stock as he checks in from Big Iron Auctions. Mark?
Hello, Max, and happy Thanksgiving. Harvest is wrapping up in a lot of the areas, and we definitely want to give thanks to the bountiful harvest and to all the farmers and those who support agriculture as we manufacture the food, fiber, and fuel that's used throughout this country. We do have some great auctions here on November the 23rd on BigIron.com. Richard Oshner is retiring from Windsor, Colorado. He's got a Case IH 3900 series disc. He's got a very sharp John Deere 7730 mechanical front tractor, and he's got a John Deere 7100 series 6-row 30 planter. Mark Cruz is retiring from Parnell, Iowa. He's got a 2020 Vermeer 605N select round baler, and he's got a McCormick MTX 135 mechanical front tractor with only 1,500 hours. Ivan Johnson is retiring from Chapel, Nebraska. They've got a 2018 Massey Ferguson Heston 1383 Razor Bar disc bind mower conditioner, and they've also got a John Deere 7420 mechanical front tractor with a loader. The land market is still super hot lot. We're seeing land selling across the country in the teens and in the $20,000 per acre range. For a complete listing of all of our land auctions, go to Big Iron and SullivanAuctioneers.com.
Well, folks, it's time to dig a little bit deeper into Greg Sollier's forecast. And Greg, you mentioned in the forecast earlier on the show that there was the potential for some moisture to develop here over the heartland over the next couple weeks. Bring us up to speed. How would that impact the drought?
Well, the drought is certainly the story, and over a very wide area of the country. Let's take a look at it. I think the numbers coming in over the past week or so, 85% of the country in some sense of either abnormally dry or drought category, with the exception of the Great Lakes region, the northeast of New England, Florida ways, because of the hurricanes Ian and Nicole, and pockets of the west. There is the story. Many areas way too dry this time of the year, and even sooner than that. We wanted to get some moisture in the grounds before they firm up and lock up. Hopefully for some, it will be a busier winter weather pattern.
Well, Greg, so when do you expect to see that kick off? You mentioned there are some movements of moisture here coming. Yes. Is this the start of a big pattern shift?
For now, only with regard to temperature. But if we take a look at how things play out here for the remainder of the month of November, here it is, the drought monitor giving way to the outlook here, outlook monitor, again put together by the folks at the National Weather Service and the Climate Prediction Center. And we've seen some fruition of this already into the southern plains areas of Oklahoma and Texas. Some marginal improvement there in the forecast here for the remainder of the month of November. Improvement there in those shades of beige into the Ozarks, parts of the mid-Mississippi Valley, and even parts of central Illinois. You see those deeper hues of brown. Well, that's ongoing drought. No improvement expected there, and some worsening into the southeastern part of the country, despite some recent moisture and some crop delays, cotton harvest delays in that part of the country. We'll see what happens with La Nina. Usually it's the west. Not great news with getting additional drought improvement. Usually it is parts of the plains and especially the eastern through northern Corn Belt locales where you get deeper into a weakening La Nina. You tend to pick up a better propensity for winter storm systems.
So, Greg, we have been waiting for this La Nina to enter that weakening phase, potentially to move to a La Nina or an El Nino. Is that happening?
We'll move to a neutral state, first of all, and there's no sign of an El Nino, but with a weakening La Nina set up here, mid to late winter time, the likelihood that we'll get into a far more busier weather pattern again for the Corn Belt locales, Great Lakes region. I'm not real optimistic of an above average moisture season for the western states. And speaking of the outlook here, the weekend of December 3rd, we'll have that outlook here on This Week in Agribusiness, my winter outlook that'll take us right on through the end of March. You'll want to check that out. We'll see if there's additional improvement for parts of the plains. Most likely it'll be into the Corn Belt to Midwest.
Certainly a lot to watch there on the weather front. Greg Sollier, thanks for joining us. Over the last 5 years, Max has had the opportunity to take our cameras onto farms across this country with the help of our friends at BASF. As he's been shooting these Plan Smart, Grow Smart segments that we air here on this program, he's been getting to know these farmers and their farm families and the crops they grow and the regions in which they do it. And folks, he's met some fantastic people over the years. As we celebrate our 5 years of working together with BASF, we wanted to take a look back at some of those farmers and farm families that we've met. There are truly some outstanding operations profiled there in the Plan Smart, Grow Smart series. And if you want to learn more about that series or see some of the videos, you can do it. Just visit the website, plansmartgrowsmart.com. Thanks for joining us all here this week on This Week in Agribusiness. Join us again next week. We'll talk about the issues that continue to move the ag industry. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time right here.
Closed captioning for This Week in Agribusiness is brought to you by Kubota. Shape your world. This Week in Agribusiness is brought to you by Case IH. This Week in Agribusiness is produced by Omax Communications in association with 22 Creative Group. We invite you to visit us online at agbizweek.com.